Gratch, who's our keynote, and I met Jonathan at a conference in 2018 where he gave a talk, and I really liked that talk. So I invited him, and the conference here should have been last year, but it is this year. And he still said yes. He said yes last year, but he also said yes this year. And the title of his talk is Fantastic AI Beast, Fantasy or Inevitable. And let me just give a short bio. Jonathan Gratch is a research-full professor of computer science and psychology at the University of Southern California, and he's the director for virtual human research at USC Institute for Creative Technologies. He completed his PhD in computer science at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in 1995. His research focuses on computational models of human cognitive and social processes, especially emotion, and he explores these models' role advancing psychological theory and in shaping human-machine interaction. He is also a former president of the Association for the Advancement of Effective Computing. And I love these words, which to a film scholar like me is like really exotic. And to end, he's also the author of over 300 scientific articles. And I will let you start now, please.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And so, I mean, I'm quite an outlier, I gather, from the other attendees. So I'm a scientist and a psychologist, and don't know much about films. I watched a lot of Netflix during the pandemic, but I'm coming from a quite different discipline, I think, than many of the attendees, and I will probably use terminology that you're familiar with, but the meaning is quite different than the meaning you're familiar with. So when I say theory, I may refer to like number theory or cognitive theories of emotion. And so just to keep an open mind when interpreting what I say. And was mentioned, so my focus is really on creating artificial entities like you might see in Ex Machina. And in particular, my focus as a scientist is on emotion. And so I look to how to incorporate emotion into machines in some sense, but also how when people interact with these machines, how it evokes emotion or changes cognitive processes. And as was mentioned, I had a group called the Virtual Human Group. So at our institute, we create these sort of lifelike characters that interact with people. They reason about the environment. They can understand and express emotion, talk to you, and play various roles as teachers or entertainers or peers. And so I guess in a sense, these are fantastic beasts. And a couple of themes I want to emphasize throughout this presentation is one is how the fantastic actually shapes the way we develop technology. And as you'll see, the institute I'm embedded in is sort of imbued with science fiction and storytelling, but also how the technology in turn shapes storytelling, and in particular, the stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be human. And another theme that'll run through here, my focus is as an emotion theorist, I focus on the emotional aspects of these creations. And so it's actually an exciting time to be an emotion researcher. So it's been argued that we're really entering an affective age. And you can see this in the sciences in terms of quite substantial increases in funding into research into human emotion. Also enormous increases in publications around the topic of emotion. And it's not just in the sciences, we see this in the humanities. Of course, we're probably seeing it a little too much, emotion in politics. But in technology, there's increased interest in how do we both understand and reason about human emotion. you're probably most familiar with this in terms of companies that try to recognize your facial expressions and make guesses about what you're feeling and some of the ethical or scientific problematic issues around that. But emotion is really changing how AI conceives itself as a field. So actually, at the dawn of AI, there was interest in emotion among some of the cognitive scientists involved, but quickly focus on emotion died out. And so really, for most of the last half of the 20th century, AI was conceived of as really rational models, so logic, decision theory. And this is also reflected in some of the stories we tell about AI. But we're really at a kind of dawn of an era where emotional and social intelligence is coming to the forefront in terms of how we conceive of what these machines can and should do. And so we're seeing algorithms that help people regulate their emotions, so recognize your emotional state and give you cues for how to help you better control your emotions. So I live in Los Angeles, so road rage is one potentially useful application. But also there are algorithms that help teach people better emotional skills. So it may seem paradoxical for a machine to teach us something about emotion, but for example, there's algorithms that try to help us better use or regulate emotions in negotiations, or help people with certain disorders better understand emotions of other people. Of course, emotion is an important tool for manipulation, and AI is on top of that as well. And so there are techniques for how do we use emotion or emotional cues to, for example, get people to take their meds or buy more stuff. And for those creative artists, there are the technologies coming for you. So there are machines now that attempt to create art, to compose stories or music, even recipes that evoke emotions in people. So today I kind of want to touch on several themes. The first is I want to give a bit of historical context, because the place I work at is kind of a unique place, and there's a sort of story and history around it. Perhaps you might view it as a dystopian story, perhaps, about how we are formed and how we focus on creating these kinds of creatures. And this story really shapes how we approach technology development. And a lot of it is focused on what's called verisimilitude, which is creating the appearance of reality in the things that we create. And so the second part of the talk, I'll focus on the technology. So how do we make things that look as though they are people, both in terms of appearance and motion, but then also in terms of thought? How do they think in ways that are like people, and how can we simulate that? I'll next kind of revisit this theme of verisimilitude and try to emphasize, although much of our work really has focused on trying to make things that are perfect copies of people, that's certainly not what is done in storytelling or the cinema, and perhaps not what we should be doing as technologists. And then I'll kind of end with how the creation of these sort of emotional creatures is actually changing the way humans think about themselves and what it means to be uniquely human. Okay, so first I'll give a little bit of history. I work at a research institute at the University of Southern California called the Institute for Creative Technologies. It was formed around 2000. And there's a story around its creation. It actually, the genesis of our institute came from a series of discussions between a woman named Anita Jones. She oversaw at the time, this is in the late 90s, among other things, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Administration, which some of you may know is the sort of military think tank for creating advanced research and technology. And she was having a series of discussions with people from Hollywood, including Alex Singer, who was at Paramount. He was a director in charge of a lot of technology shows like Star Trek, MacGyver. And the reason they were talking was around the topic of simulation. So the military uses simulation quite a bit for training. So they put soldiers in environments they ideally want to evoke emotion and stress as they might feel in the battlefield, and use this to save a lot of money in terms of practicing. Actually, they even build like whole villages and cities out in the desert to try to create sort of real life role-playing simulations, but they want to do this all through technology. And the feeling was that even though some of the graphics and game research was originally funded by the military, there was a feeling that the Hollywood and the game industry is much more advanced than what the military was using at that time. And so the question became, how can we leverage Hollywood special effects, storytelling to create compelling and evocative training experiences? And that led to the founding of our institute. And the vision was, and still is, that ICT serves as a nexus between the military, academia, Hollywood, and the game industry. And the founding focus was around this concept of verisimilitude. So could we create synthetic virtual reality experiences so compelling that the participants that are in those experiences react as though it was real? Now, there's a little bit of Hollywood history and where we are. So we are in Playa Vista, California. It's a part of Los Angeles. And we're actually on the location of Howard Hughes's aircraft factory. So Howard Hughes, you probably know from The Aviator, and he had a lot of connections to Hollywood. He was infamous for this big airplane called the Spruce Goose. And our studio, our building is located here on the turning circle of this runway that used to be in this location. This is how it looks like today. And it's actually now called Silicon Beach because we're embedded in a number of high-tech companies, including Google, Facebook. ICANN is kind of the controller of the internet. Yahoo's still there. And you may have seen this campus. There was a not terribly good movie called The Circle that came out a few years ago. And my office is actually there behind Emma Watson's head. The first head of our institute, Dick Lindheim, came from Paramount Studios. He oversaw tech shows like Star Trek, Knight Rider, and he actually imbued Star Trek into our facilities. So this is a shot of our original building. It was actually designed by the set designers for Star Trek Voyager, which was a show he was overseeing at the time. The idea was to make it like a spaceship. It was actually built on Paramount backlot and slapped together, and probably only started falling apart after about a year. We even had an engine room you could look in, and in this case, we had this giant computer the size of 2 or 3 refrigerators that controlled our virtual reality simulations at the time. And his vision for the Institute was the holodeck. So the idea is, could we create these virtual characters and virtual environments that people could interact with, just as you might see on the Star Trek Enterprise. That wasn't the only vision. So another of our directors, Kim LeMasters, also from Hollywood, came from NBC Studios, but he was involved as a writer on Westworld and Wild Wild West. And he had alternative vision. Could we create things like the Wild West? And so just to give you an example of some of the stuff we do, this is one of the collaborations we did between the technologists and the storytellers. Could we create essentially something akin to Westworld?
Welcome to Gunslinger and the Clementine Saloon. Step inside and be transported to another time and place.
You're in Colima. Once it was a good place, but now it's a dying town.
There's something familiar about the locals left here.
I'm Utah. This here is my saloon.
They're the time-honored residents of any good western watering hole, the bartender, the bar girl.
My name is Harmony. Well, I'm in stress management.
Help yourself to any drink you want. We'll settle up before you leave.
But there's something different, too. These are virtual humans in a mixed reality demonstration that pushes character-driven immersive experiences to a whole new frontier.
Are you ready?
Hold on to your hat. This is going to get interesting. With computer vision and natural language understanding,
Where are you from?
Kentucky. I moved here to get my career started.
the characters can track who is being spoken to.
How about you? Where are you from?
I moved here from Gatlin, Tennessee many, many years ago.
This sophisticated natural language system lets the characters be interrupted.
Shut the hell up right now.
You shut the hell up.
Be quiet, you idiot.
So it gives you a little sense of what we mean by virtual humans. This institute has had an impact over the years on different fields. So one big focus of our output is in terms of feeding back into Hollywood. And so these are a number of films that which ICT has credits, including we have one Oscar. And generally speaking, the connection to Hollywood is really around digital special effects. So creating, for example, when Paul Walker passed away during the shooting of Furious 7, they needed a digital Paul Walker, which we were able to create. A lot of our output feeds into the military, basically around creating training simulations of various kinds, and usually interpersonal skills training. So you have interactions with other virtual people. So for example, Divis is a training system to help train people how to deal with issues that might arise in the workplace around sexual assault. And so you would actually practice your interview skills with a virtual character you see here, interviewing them about issues around a reported sexual assault. And then the computers are watching how you're talking and responding and giving you feedback on if you're asking appropriate questions or how you could do the interview better. And an important part of our output is to influence academia and in various, basically computer science fields, and through also in terms of publications. Now, let me transition to some of the underlying technology that we use to create these simulations. And I'll emphasize different aspects. So first is, how do we create realistic appearance of characters? How do we make them move in realistic ways, and how AI plays a role in that process? So let's start with appearance. So if we want to create a digital character that looks like a person, how do we do that? And basically, the primary focus here at the Institute is capturing real data on real people. So Paul Devevic was the head of our graphics lab. His main innovation is something called the light stage. This is a very large light stage that can capture entire body. A lot of the focus has been more on the face, and Paul will give you a brief introduction of how that works.
So what you'll see behind me is Light Stage 5, and this is a device for capturing how a person's face reflects light.
Expression 1, here we go, 3, 2, 1.
Has 156 light-emitting diodes at all the corners and vertices of this big geodesic structure here, and they're synchronized to these high-speed digital cameras. So if a person sits inside of there, in a very short period of time, you'll get images of them lit from every different direction that light can come from. And that's the perfect kind of data set that you need if you want to create a digital version of that actor that reflects light the same way that the real person does, and thus looks exactly like the real person when they're going through all of their stunt performances.
So one thing I want to emphasize, Paul there was saying, is what's important is not just the geometry and the appearance of the person, but the light. So let me give an example of that. So often what's done in digital effects is you'll photograph or film somebody in a green screen, and then you can composite them into a different environment. What you might notice from this image is, although this person's now in a blue environment, there's still green on her because the green from the green screen is reflecting onto her image and creating an appearance of she's still in a green environment. And actually those kind of visual artifacts can be used, for example, in deep fakes to tell that this person doesn't actually belong in that environment. But if you actually capture light from all possible angles of how the skin goes through or reflects off a person's body, you can then relight those digital models so that they actually appear to be in whatever environment you want. And so what you're seeing in this video is we're sampling light from different environments and then adjusting the lighting on this digital character so that it matches the environment that we want to composite them into. That makes it really feel like that character is in that environment because they're essentially being lit as though they were in this virtual environment. So that's sort of the appearance, making things look at the surface like it's real. But of course, people move. They move their face, they move their bodies. And so we have to be able to capture and simulate that as well. And so generally speaking, we use techniques to record actual human motion that you can then translate and apply to these digital models. So the simple approach is really just what's called motion capture. So here we have an actor in a motion studio. There's cameras all around, and that allows you to track the skeleton. And then you can essentially replay the exact motion of that character onto this digital character. And that's for bodies. You can do that as well for the face. You probably have seen in the past people put little dots on the face, but now techniques have advanced so we can do this entirely with computer vision. So using really just a monocular camera, you can reconstruct the 3D geometry of the face and how it moves moment to moment, and then translate that onto your face. Even your Apple iPhone can do this quite well now. Okay, so that's capturing sort of the face and basic movement, and that alone can go quite far. So just capturing this appearance and recording motion allows us now to transform many ways in which we might tell stories. And so within Hollywood, this is often done primarily just to create these digital models. But another theme I want to emphasize is that storytelling also shapes the way we think about and use this technology. So as you've seen, there's Star Trek plays a recurring theme in the genesis of our institute. There's stories around Star Trek and how one might use technology that kind of shape how we think about applications. So for those who are Star Trek fans, The Return of the Archons was a story where the leader of a civilization passed away, but he had a computer simulation of himself, his thoughts and appearance that would continue to live on after he died and tell stories. And so one way we've tried to do similar things, so this is a collaboration with the Shoah Foundation. So around issues of the Holocaust, right now what is done today is Holocaust survivors will go into schools or into museums and talk to people and tell their stories as a way to keep the idea of the Holocaust alive. But the issue is that many of the people involved in the Holocaust are passing away. And so the question was, could we use technology to allow these storytellers to live on and continue to tell their stories? And so New Dimensions in Testimony is one project for digitally preserving these Holocaust survivor stories in a full 3D interactive experience. So this is a little example of that.
Do you remember any songs from your youth?
This is a lullaby that my mother used to sing to me, and I still remember it. It's in Polish. Jadą dzieci, jadą drogą, siostrzyczka I brat, I nawidzieć się nie mogą, jaki piękny świat.
So the way this works is we use the light stage to capture 3D geometry of, in this case, Holocaust survivor Pinchas Günther. His appearance, the way light moves off his body, but also his story. So we have like about 1,000 clips of him answering various questions. And then we import those clips into a natural language dialogue system. And so the way the system works is people can ask questions and then using information retrieval techniques, it tries to figure out which of these clips best addresses the question that was just asked, and then plays the actual recording of his answer to that particular question. This has been used sort of a traveling roadshow, taken to different museums it was for a while in New York City's Museum of Jewish Heritage. And so it would allow people to, I think in this time, there's about 4 or 5 survivors that have been digitally preserved in this way. So to kind of summarize where we are so far, technology does a good job of recording and replaying high fidelity appearance and motion, geometry, reflectance, and expressions and gestures. But what if we want to create something that's new or somehow transform that appearance? We don't want to always just play a recording. We often want to adjust it in certain ways. So imagine, we have an actor in our scene, but the director thinks he's a little bit too old. So could we sort of digitally adjust him to be younger? Or perhaps, no, I want a woman, or maybe a woman of color, or maybe she needs to look a little happier. These actually images, these are all people that don't actually exist. What we're using here is machine learning techniques, something called generative adversarial networks, where you can actually learn automatically to create something that appears very much like a human, and then actually adjust various parameters of that humanness, including skin color, age, and other aspects, demographic aspects of appearance. That's the appearance, but also, people move. And so how do we alter motion? So what we've talked about before is we're just purely making a recording that we want to play back. But when we play back a recording, it may not necessarily fit within the scene that we want to use. So in this case, there's an obstacle that the character needs to go around. So how do we transform that motion in ways that allow that character to actually better seem like they fit within the environment? And there's basically 2 approaches we can take to doing that. One is what's called a concatenative approach, and the other is procedural animation. So the concatenative approach, essentially what you do is have lots and lots of clips of different types of motion, and then the computer automatically figures out what are good transition points between one animation sequence and another. And this often was done in computer games that allows characters, say, to transition from running to walking to fighting, and so forth. And this is also basically a technique that's used in modern speech synthesis. So when you hear Alexa talking, some human is actually said a whole lot of sentences which they automatically break up into phonemes, and then they can reconstruct in novel ways. The advantage is that this looks and sounds quite real, but you have very limited range of control over the motion. And so the other approach is what's known as procedural animation. So you have computers generate entirely novel motion under certain constraints to generate the particular look or feel or emotion you want. So one example of this is a project called Cerebella at our lab, which is the idea is, could we take an actor reading a script and then actually automatically control all the motion, nonverbal behavior of the character that represents that line. So here we see some actors just kind of doing an early read of a script, and the system's trying to visualize in nonverbal behavior what these characters might do. The way this approach works is it takes the spoken audio and the text to infer what are reasonable gestures. So if you study gesture, you will know that the prosody of the speech, the kind of tones of our speech determine some of the gestures. So we tend to gesture at points of peak prosodic emphasis, or eyebrows go up when we want to emphasize certain points, which is both in the audio signal and in our face. But also the meaning is conveyed through nonverbal behavior. And so if I want to say something like, I want you to come together over some topic, we're using gestures to convey semantic information. And so what the system does is it analyzes the audio to figure out sort of where, what's the intensity of the speech, what's the affect in the speech, what are important emphasis points that we want the characters to synchronize their gestures to, but also what are the sort of metaphoric information that should be conveyed through behavior. And so this is an example of the system at work. So we basically, Stacy Marcel and Ari Shapiro developed this, took a video movie clip and then ran it through the system and created characters that would try to simulate the scene that was occurring in that movie.
You snotty little bastard.
Your Honor, I'd like to ask for a recess.
I'd like an answer to the question, Judge.
The court will wait for an answer.
If Lieutenant Kendrick gave an order that Santiago wasn't to be touched, then why did he have to be transferred? Colonel, Lieutenant Kendrick ordered the code red, didn't he? Because that's what you told Lieutenant Kendrick to do.
Object!
And when it went bad, you cut these guys loose!
Your Honor!
You had markets inside a phony transfer.
Your Honor!
You doctored the logbook.
Damn it, Captain!
You coerced the doctor.
Consider yourself in contempt.
Colonel!
Okay, so to kind of summarize where we're at so far, we've talked about how you can capture and simulate appearance, how you can drive motion, and how AI can automate many of those processes. But a lot of what actors and people do is that they have a brain. So in a movie, that's not so much an issue; it's all laid out in advance. But if you're in an interactive environment where there's a human in the loop making decisions, these characters have to be smart and respond in appropriate ways. And so that really takes us into the realm of like what Westworld is. So Westworld really is an amazing interactive theme park where the simulated people need to act in ways just like real people.
Your heart breaks for these characters who we know are not human, but it doesn't matter because you begin to connect with them, which is the very premise of the show, that at a certain point it becomes irrelevant whether something is organic or not.
So how could we create Westworld? And so, how does a machine know what it should feel moment to moment? How does it display those expressions in a way that convey that it's alive and real? How do these simulated emotions change its decisions so it acts in ways that make sense? How can it sense our own emotions and use that in its own decision making? And how can it react, for example, to touch? Do we feel sad for it? How does it change how we treat other people? So these are all kind of central questions around my research into emotion. And so if we want to think about emotion, and this is where I put on my psychologist hat, there's really a couple different theories that we can draw on from inspiration. So within emotion theory, emotions are sometimes thought of as sort of top-down processes that arise from thought. And so the idea is that thought precedes emotion, and as we construe a situation, that influences our behavior. On the other hand, emotion is sometimes seen as more of a bottom-up process. And so low-level features in the environment automatically trigger physiological behavioral responses in ourselves, which lead us to then feel emotion. So that one kind of distinction is if a bear comes in the room, I would think, okay, bear, that's a dangerous object, I should be scared. Then I feel scared and run away, versus William James would argue the bear comes in the room, our body automatically gets scared, starts running away, and then our mind goes, oh, I guess I'm afraid. So in terms of top-down theories of emotion, the primary model that has influenced psychological research is what's called appraisal theory. Appraisal theory emphasizes that a priori beliefs and goals determine and shape emotional responses, and that cognitive processes are sort of essential for initiating the emotional response. So the kind of way to think about appraisal theory is that emotion is a relational construct that characterizes how we're doing in the world. And so it relates both mental state to environmental events. And so if my character in Westworld has this goal that they want to live, and an event occurs in the world that that goal is threatened, that event is appraised along a number of dimensions. So is this good or bad? Well, it's not so good because I want to live. Was this expected? Is there some control over the situation? And who is responsible for this event? So these appraisals determine the type of response that a character might have. And so if something is negative but controllable, one might respond with anger. Whereas if something is negative but uncontrollable, one might respond with fear. If I blame you, I will be angry at you. If I blame myself, I will be angry at myself. And so these patterns of judgments, almost like a decision tree, determine the likely emotional response. And so what's nice about this appraisal theory is that these judgments actually map onto constructs that are well understood within artificial intelligence. So utility theory talks about goals and whether goals are satisfied or unsatisfied. Algorithms use probability to make inferences. Control maps onto constructs like planning. So if a goal is threatened, do I have a plan to restore that goal and make it true again? And blameworthiness maps onto cognitive processes like credit assignment. And so AI has developed a number of methods to reason about these processes. So in terms of goals, AI has algorithms that can construct plans. So let's say in this case, we're trying to make a stack of blocks. So that to create the stack of blocks, we need to have actions that we can execute in the world to put blocks on top of each other. And these structures, these representations allow us to reason about the world and how certain events might impact our goals. So if we're trying to build this little tower, ABC, and we successfully get C off of A, we're making progress to our goal. Our chance of success is increasing. And so we might feel more hopeful that we'd obtain our goals. But then if like somebody comes in and moves one of these blocks, that may be perceived as a threat because it's getting in the way of us achieving our plan. And so what we do when we're creating these characters is we give them these algorithms that allow them to develop plans and then reason about how events in the world impact the probability and utility of goal achievement. So another very simple example, because we live in LA, imagine I want to go surfing this morning. And I look out the window and I see there's no waves, then the fact that there's no waves is essentially defeating my plans to go surfing. And so we have simple rules that can analyze these semantic structures and infer, for example, my goal of surfing is threatened, and so therefore I should be sad. On the other hand, I could do some inferences and take action in the world. Maybe I can call the surf report and find out, in fact, there's some waves down in Huntington Beach. And therefore, now that I have this new information, that changes the way I appraise the situation. And now I'm hopeful I can actually go and get some waves until I look at the traffic report. So just coming back to the military, we use these models to drive virtual characters and simulations. So this is quite some number of years ago, but a simulation that was designed to help soldiers practice negotiation skills in an intercultural context. And so the idea would be you would enter this virtual environment and you could talk to characters, say certain things, and then they would appraise your actions and respond in emotionally appropriate ways.
In this simulated negotiation, each character is an autonomous agent driven by its own beliefs, desires, intentions, and understanding of the social context. The trainee can influence individual characters through his words or actions. Coalitions between characters can emerge and change based on interactions between the autonomous agents, the trainee, and events in the world.
Hello, gentlemen.
Hello, Captain.
Hello, Captain.
Thank you for meeting with me.
How may I help you?
I have orders to move this clinic to a camp near the U.S. base.
To evaluate demands such as this, the characters use a psychological theory of emotions called Appraisal Theory. Each character forms appraisals of the state based on their goals. Positive appraisals appear in green, while negative appraisals are in red. In this case, the doctor has a strong goal to maintain neutrality. Thus, he sees a move near the U.S. base as threatening. These appraisals are then used to form an assessment of the suggested action in emotional terms such as fear or hope. Thus, the emotion model is central to decision-making in virtual humans. With their negative view of the suggested move, the characters at first try to avoid the negotiation.
We have many matters to attend to.
So that's how you can use appraisal theory in a very cognitive top-down model to generate what seem like situationally plausible emotions that the characters have in response to events in the world, including speech acts that you might say to them. Other theories of emotion argue that emotion is much more tied to the world and the environment. It's less cognitive, that people are sort of reacting moment to moment, almost without thought, to the stimuli that they see. And a lot of the stimuli they see is other people. And so when you look at people in social situations, what you'll often see is this very tight interaction between their expressions, the other expressions, these feedback loops, which are sometimes called emotional contagion or rapport. It's more non-cognitive. You're almost reacting, catching the emotions of someone without thought. And so the question is, could we get machines to catch the emotions of other people in these kind of sort of bottom-up way as well? And how might we do that? And so, largely what we do is, again, focus on real human data. So we collect lots of data of people interacting. In this case, the focus is on, could we create good listeners? And so we wanted to look at people who are talking, but then focus on the subtle nonverbal behaviors that good listeners do. So listening behaviors are actually very helpful. That's why Zoom is so discouraging, because I can't see the audience. But when you see people talk, what you'll see is these subtle, what are called back channel feedback.
I guess she's trying to get something out of this guy. So those are the two clips.
So people nod, they smile, and these are actually important social cues that help us communicate better. So what we can do with the technology is we can actually analyze moment to moment the facial expressions that people are producing, where they're looking, the postures of their body, the prosody and analysis of their speech patterns, but do that both for speakers and listeners. So as this woman is talking, what is the listener doing with her head, with her postures, with her body? And then use machine learning techniques to try to learn a predictive model that will predict what is this listener doing in response to what the speaker is doing. So this is a very simple example of that approach. So here we're seeing our bartender from our gunslinger application. We tend to reuse a lot of our digital assets. And so my PhD student here, Li Xing, created this system. So the character just goes through a script, asks a series of questions, but then as the person answers the question, it tries to convey that it's actually attending and listening carefully to what he's saying.
What are your favorite things to do in your free time?
My favorite things to do in my free time is I like playing ping pong, I like playing soccer, and I like playing video games. That's it.
What characteristics about yourself are you most proud of?
I think I am pretty honest. I'm an easygoing person, and I think I'm working very hard.
Now, what I mentioned, I'm also a psychologist, and so part of what we do is look at how people respond to these kind of characters. And what we see, actually, these sort of low-level emotional behaviors are actually quite important, and people feel like they have a connection when they're talking to a character like this. They feel like they're listened to, and they actually open up more and reveal more intimate information about themselves. And so one might ask, what are ways that we could use this technology to achieve socially beneficial goals? So one big project we worked on, something called the SimSensei project, was to try to use these characters to help people with issues of mental health, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder. Often people who experience PTSD are very reluctant to open up and reveal their symptoms, which can make it hard to diagnose them. And so the question was, could we get characters like this to actually get people to talk more than they might talk to a person? So this is Ellie. She's our character that engages in these kind of interviews. Here you're seeing what we kind of call the Terminator view of Ellie. So this is, you're seeing what Ellie sees. So she can track facial expressions and aspects of this person's behavior. And I'll play a little clip of how the system works.
Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure environment. I'm not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would love to learn about you. I'll ask a few questions to get us started. And please feel free to tell me anything. Your answers are totally confidential. Are you okay with this?
Yes.
So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
That's good. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Los Angeles.
Oh, I'm from LA myself.
So what we're seeing here, the sort of mesh on the person's face, that's moment-to-moment facial expression tracking. We're analyzing emotion and the audio signal. We're looking at this person's gestures and posture. We're translating, transcribing the words that he's saying and performing what's called sentiment analysis to try to detect emotion in the speech. And then this character is doing these sort of low-level automatic behaviors to try to draw the person out. Ultimately, the goal here is to estimate prevalence of depression. So one place we've tried to use this is in the military, trying to get soldiers to open up about mental health issues. And so we ran a study on active duty military personnel coming back from Afghanistan. And when you come back from deployment, what you're supposed to do is fill out a little form called the post-deployment health questionnaire to see if you experience PTSD and if you need to seek help. And so the question was, could we actually get more information from people by having them talk to this character than you would actually get from them filling out the standard form? And in studies we've shown, in fact, we do. So people actually reveal twice as many symptoms of PTSD to this character than they do on the form that they need to turn into the military. Even if it's anonymized, so they don't believe that people know their answers, they still open up more to this character. So let me give you a little example of this. This is a soldier. She actually experienced a fairly traumatic event. Her convoy was hit by an IED, improvised explosive device, and the vehicle in front of her exploded and people caught fire. And one of the questions around PTSD is, does this lead to nightmares? And on her form, she indicated it did not. But then she had this interaction with the character, and this is her interaction.
Can you tell me about any bad dreams you've had about your experiences, or times when thoughts or memories just keep going through your head when you wish they wouldn't?
Sure, Ellie. What do you want to know? Wake up thinking I'm dying? Yes. Thinking I'm on fire? Sure. thinking I didn't get out of my vehicle, yep. Thinking that I left a guy stuck in a vehicle, yep. Oh, I can't do this. What? Feeling stuck on the X, yep. What? Thinking that, you know, more fuckers were gonna come out of the crowd, sure. I've had every fucking dream there is to have, so. But they're just dreams, so. I mean, I'm thankful for that, because it didn't happen, right? Got blown up, got out the vehicle, I'm fine, I'm safe, nobody died, nobody lost a limb, nobody was gravely injured. I'm here to tell the story, so I'm thankful for that. So, there, you know, those are all the positives. So dreams are just dreams. You wake up and, you know, you push that shit out of your head. You go on with your life. Yeah.
How much of a problem has this been for you?
It's not a problem. It's just, it's life.
And this is her final answer that is very common. What you'll see in soldiers and people suffering PTSD is they feel like they have control of the situation, whereas a trained therapist would realize there's some issues here that need to be addressed through therapy. So that's an example of where you can use this technology for medically beneficial issue, but you know the technology is neutral and you can use it in many different ways. And sometimes this can have unintended consequences. So one of the things we do is sort of study how people respond socially to these characters, and does it sort of carry over into other aspects of their life. So humans have many psychological needs. An important need is to need to be social, to feel connected to other people. And you can often think of this need as something like a hunger. So we are hungry for social interaction, you know, particularly in the era of COVID, right? And when we have good social interactions, that sates our hunger, and we don't feel motivated to be social until we get hungry again. And we've actually found evidence that people have their social hunger satisfied by interactions with these virtual characters. So if you have a good interaction with Ellie, you feel like you've snacked on social needs, and now you are less motivated to reach out and talk to a friend. And that can potentially have negative consequences. And this has been studied quite a bit in technologies like Facebook, which also have a similar feeling. So when we interact with Facebook, we feel like we're connected to other people, but it's really empty calories. So what you often find is people that heavily use Facebook are actually incredibly lonely long-term, because they've sort of undermined the need to have real social connections with other people. And that contributes to chronic mental illness. Now that's sort of an unintentional consequence, but there's actually, you can use this technology in very intentional ways to achieve goals which might not necessarily benefit the end user. So we've done studies with Ellie where, rather than asking about mental health, we ask people about their finances. And we can show that they will reveal more information about sensitive financial information to this kind of character than they might if they're having a normal interaction with a person. Other things we've looked at is really using emotional cues to manipulate people in various ways. So a lot of my research, we study negotiation processes. So in negotiation, emotion is a very important tool of manipulation. So I can, for example, show I'm really interested in something I'm not interested in, and then trade that off for concessions to benefit myself. Or I can show anger to try to extract concessions. And so we build characters that can deploy these kinds of techniques. So this is an example. In this case, people negotiate with this character about how to divide up these different items, chairs, plates, and clocks. And they actually get real money at the end of the day based on how well they do in the negotiation.
Well, I don't think we're going to come to an agreement.
It's pretty obvious that we both want the chairs.
It's pretty obvious, isn't it? But
Yeah.
you know, like I said, I'll give you one.
Well,
How about that?
that doesn't seem fair, though.
It doesn't? Well,
Not really.
I guess we can't come to no agreement then, can we?
In fact, these techniques are actually incredibly powerful. One way to see that, so every year there's a competition at the major AI conference where people build agents that negotiate with people, and then the winner is the one that basically got the most money out of the humans. And so we used these manipulative techniques one year in the competition, and we were able to soundly defeat all the other agents in that competition. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the technology. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and revisit this concept of verisimilitude. So the idea behind ICT is we want to create these experiences so compelling that the participants react as though it is real. And much of what I've talked about up to this point, and most of the focus of our institute is really on real, using big data on actual people to collect how they move, how they look, to make these models. But verisimilitude is actually not the same thing as realism. So realism is concerned with facts, with truth, with reality, where verisimilitude is really about appearance, perception, seeming to be true. And from psychology, what we know is our perceptions of reality is a social construct. So we don't actually perceive the world as it is. Our perception is heavily shaped by beliefs, biases, cultures. It's constructed. And we can see this by looking, for example, at emotion. So common folk psychology of emotion is really well exemplified by the movie Inside Out. So people kind of have this feeling that we have these little guys in our head called emotions, and they take control of our body at different points of time, and those controls show in our voice and our face, and these kind of prototypical expressions we see here from Paul Ekman. But what we know from the science is that these basic emotions are illusionary, that they're a social construct. So there's actually little evidence that there is, say, a joy or hope circuit in the brain. And in fact, when you look at people's behavior, they almost never show these prototypical expressions that we think that people often show. Another way to look at this is we can go back to the question of depression. So the kind of one approach, and the sort of the ICT approach, is to look at, what does depression actually look like? And so we can capture lots of videos of people that are depressed or not depressed. We can automatically detect different behaviors, and then we can learn correlations to see, well, for example, does the lack of smile predict depression? Does frowning predict depression? And so that's in some sense the realism, the truth behind depression. This is how it is actually expressed. But then we can also look at what do people think depression looks like. And so again, we can show lots of videos to observers, and we can figure out what cues they are using to decide if this person is depressed. And in some sense, this is the perception of depression. And what we can show is, in fact, people are wrong. Their perception of what depression is quite different than the underlying reality. And so that creates an interesting dilemma when we're creating these kinds of characters. So let's say, for example, we want to create a video game where we have a depressed character. Should the behaviors of this character actually be real in the sense of how depression is actually conveyed, or should they be what people think depression is, what they perceive? And if you look at what's done in cinema often, is it's more about maximizing people's ability to decode the intended emotion rather than what the actual emotion looks like. So if we look at, this is a little extreme, but if we look at Jack, his behaviors are quite extreme. And in fact, although he's an outlier, this is fairly common. So people have analyzed from a psychological perspective what actors do. They behave in very unrealistic ways. They emote at unrealistic rates. The emotions they show are much more aligned with the situation they're in. There's very little dissemblance or faking of their emotion. And that makes them easier to understand, both by people and machines. And interestingly, people that watch a lot of cinema actually think that's the way real people act more than people who are more embedded in the real world. But that may be okay. So from the perspective of building these characters, I mean, we're not necessarily trying to make them real. We're trying to make them have an effect, say to teach a skill or to evoke an emotion, to persuade or influence. And that may not necessarily require making them act in true ways. And you can see this, for example, in educational content. So if you look at a medical textbook, you're not shown a lot of pictures of real hearts. You're shown very stylized images that draw your attention to the important features that you're trying to learn. And in cinema, if we want to convey that this person is a pig, it can be very effectively conveyed by sort of literally morphing in a bit of pig into his appearance. And there's actually a biological basis to inform why these kinds of stylistic techniques are incredibly powerful. So within animal research, there's a concept called supernormal stimuli. And the idea is that sort of abstractions of the stimuli can actually be a more powerful elicitor of behavior than the real thing. So one example is, this is a stickleback fish, and this red color is an indicator that this is a male. This gray color is an indicator that this is a female. And so these cues tend to elicit behavior. So if a male stickleback fish sees something like this, he almost automatically goes and attacks, where this kind of behavior automatically triggers behaviors like coupling. But if you throw this kind of hockey puck looking thing into the fish tank, the fish will attack this much more than a very realistic simulation of the fish. So this is what's called a supernormal stimuli. It's more powerful at evoking a behavioral response than the quote unquote truth. And we see this in humans as well, that we use certain stylizations to evoke and rapidly communicate responses. And so rather than necessarily making these things truly real, we might want to use technology to make these things better match what we want them to look like rather than what they truly are. So how could we do this? It's easy to collect, how things really are in the real world. It's harder to collect how people would perceive them to be or want them to be. Normally, you need to fill out questionnaires, but perhaps there's ways to actually tap into the brain to get at sort of people's perception rather than the ground truth. And so this is one project where they actually try to use brain waves to figure out perceptions of beauty. Could we actually measure your brain and figure out what you perceive beauty to be automatically? So let's show a little clip of that. So basically they can record EEG and look at things like error-related potential in conjunction with machine learning to sort of predict which images this individual finds as being attractive or unattractive, construct a model of the type of faces this person seems to find to be beautiful, and then use interpolation to create sort of a composite new face that better matches what this person's idealized sense of beauty is. And this is not saying anything, it's just purely just looking at their brain reactions to different images. Okay, so just to wrap up, I kind of emphasize this theme that the fantasy influences how we think about and use the technology. But I just want to close by talking about some of the ways that technology shapes the stories we have and particularly stories we have about what it means to be human. So humans have many basic needs, and one of them is to feel somehow that we are unique, that we're important. And throughout history, often we've contrasted ourselves with animals. And so we sort of tell stories about ourselves about how we are more important or more unique or more special than animals. And psychologists have sort of looked into the constructs that people use to make these definitions. And generally speaking, we see ourselves compared to animals as having culture. We are intelligent. We can use rationality and logic, whereas animals are more irrational. They're more emotional, instinctual. And when we demonize outgroups, even humans, we often imbue them by having animalistic traits. And you see this in political discourse as well. You often see sort of animalistic terms used to describe other parties. But there's sort of a new kid on the block now, AI. And AI has been challenging our sense of what it needs to be uniquely human. In particular, these machines seem to be crushing us in the realm of intellect, which leads people, when their identity is threatened, they need to sort of reconceive what their identity is to preserve this notion that we are unique. And so we could ask, what is one skill or attribute that you might think AI is never going to be able to achieve or replicate? And we ask people this, and what the answer is people think it's emotion, so that humans are better in entertainment, creativity, storytelling. Human emotion is something you can never program into a computer. And you see this reflected in the kinds of stories we tell about ourselves as to what makes us unique. And so this elevates actually emotion as being something important as what it is that makes us uniquely human. And so a different frame of reference is to say that, compared to AI, humans are warm, or open, or emotional, we have depth. And when we contrast this with sort of mechanistic machines. And there was actually an interesting experiment that showed this working in real time. So there were researchers in Korea that were studying how people define themselves as being unique, and what traits do they ascribe to themselves as helping them believe themselves to be uniquely human. And as they were running the study, this was when Google's AlphaGo algorithm crushed the Korean Go master. And they actually saw a shift in their data from people initially describing intelligence as being a very important, uniquely human trait. And after this tournament, suddenly the data started to change, and people elevated the importance of emotion as being what makes us uniquely human. So where does that leave us? I think there's a lot of angst about technology and AI in particular. And so you'll see important thinkers saying things like the robot will take the place that slave labor occupied, or we're creating our own successors, we'll become to machine what the horse and dog are to man, or men have become the tools of their tools. But to keep things in perspective, actually, these are quite old quotes. So we seem to have muddled through with these concerns for quite a while. And so that leads perhaps to some hope that we'll find ways to maintain our sense of importance and humanity as we move forward. So I think I want to wrap it up at that point. Give special thanks to my research group, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. And hopefully someone's still there.
Jonathan, thank you very, very much. And I think that someone is still here. At least you can see behind me, Cecilia came in. So she's just walking up here. And I'm going to opening up. I will look in the chat, and I will actually start by opening up the chat. And if people in the chat do not have questions, then I have some questions for you. But thank you for an amazingly rich and interesting, and also both sort of terrifying talk. And Oh, it makes me think a lot about the future and the present. So let me see in the chat. Sue writes, this is something that is often discussed in the disabled, chronically ill community. People usually have to perform pain or distress in order to have medical professionals take these issues seriously. And I'm not sure whether that is a comment or a question. Sue, do you want to talk?
It's a comment.
Hi, yes. Sorry, that wasn't really a question. I was just reacting at the moment when you said that people don't necessarily react or don't necessarily or it doesn't really matter what the truth of the experience of the person is. We react to the display of emotions, and that's something that has been, you know, made. Well, I'm autistic and disabled myself, and there's something that's quite discussed, you know, in our community. The idea that it's quite hard to get medical professionals to take the issues seriously unless you perform in some way, you know, the issues that you describe. So if you're used to pain, you don't necessarily display pain to the same level that someone is not used to it would. So when you go to a medical professional and you use, you know, the kind of pain scale they give you, and if you say, yes, today it's 8, but you don't display what they think you should be displaying at number 8, then they might not necessarily believe you and, you know, deal with pain management in the way that you would actually require. So yeah, that was just a question, not really a question, just I was reacting to what you said. It was a fascinating talk overall, and I think I'll need a bit of time to put my ideas in place, and I'll have questions like tomorrow or something. But thank you so much. I'll leave the floor to other people now.
Yeah, that's certainly fine. The comment that triggers is, so one actually interesting issue in our field is, you know, is it ethical for a machine to convey emotion, in that presumably the machine doesn't actually feel emotion. So there's a sense in which that display is by definition manipulative. And the one thing just to highlight is that, in fact, most, I would argue, displays of emotion that humans use are not actually necessarily conveying what they feel in the moment, but they're being used as tools of social influence. So people use expressions to change the way a conversation is unfolding, even if they don't necessarily feel it. In fact, certain emotion theorists like Alan Fridlin argue that it is never the case that an emotion shows honestly what you feel, that they are conveying social motives. And so to the extent that a machine actually has social motives, it wants you to reveal something about your mental health, or it wants to convince you to turn over all your money or privacy. It is, I think it's not the fact that it's showing emotion per se that is unethical, but rather what is the use to which that display is being used towards. So it complicates. I think just saying machines shouldn't show emotion is a sort of overly simple view that people use emotion to get things done. And just as you're saying that I might need to upregulate the expressions of pain to get something done, in this case, to receive medical treatment. And that's totally fine and appropriate for that patient to do in the moment.
That is really funny in terms of, you know, Zoom calls as well. Like, it's the third conference that I go to on Zoom, and it took me a good while to stop just smiling and nodding along, because I realized that no one could actually see me. And in the reverse, it's very difficult when you're doing a presentation and you don't have that, you know, positive feedback from people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Jonathan, there is a question here from Thomas. And Thomas, you should be allowed to speak.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this presentation, John. This is very, very fascinating. There's so much going on in it. This is kind of a question on the question of computer-generated art and music and all that, because I think what that debate often downplays is how art isn't consumed in a vacuum. It's not that we see a piece of art and then just for the piece of art. There's with music, we're also very interested in the performers. With authors, we're interested in the authors' personalities. We're interested in all these very human motives and human stories that underlie the product of the art. And I feel like that's something where computer-generated art, by definition, will struggle to kind of compete, so to speak, with authentic human products. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is that an issue or a point of discussion in terms of computer-generated art and music and so on?
Well, so I'm less. I mean, I'm less familiar with that aspect, but I think there's some research that helps think about that question. So a lot of my research is, do people view these characters as though they are people? So, for example, do I feel the need to be polite when I talk to a virtual character? And so in some sense, that if I feel the need to be polite to them, I'm treating them as though they are a person. So a lot of the psychology around these media speaks to the question of do you view, and to bring it to your question, do you feel as a human author there for this computer generated music? And often what we do is we have people interact with these characters and we measure the extent to which they elicit social behavior. So are they polite? Do they get angry when the character threatens their sense of self or what have you? And what you see is that the most important determinant for those effects is, do you believe there is a human controlling this character? So if you actually are told up ahead, this is not a computer generated character, this is actually an avatar, there's someone wired up generating these behaviors, then you're very comfortable, even if it's very stylized, you're very comfortable treating this like a real person. And when you're told, oh, this is an AI, you start treating it differently. However, what you see is the more that character appears and acts and responds in ways that are real, then that difference goes away. So if it is quite real, it's almost like you cannot help but use these automatic action patterns and heuristics that you've developed over your life to respond to people. You apply those automatically to these characters. And so I would argue, if we take, it's a bit of a leap, but if we take this to art, to the extent to which the art seems to actually tap into the cultural milieu for which the art emerged, to the extent to which the art appears to be authentic, my guess would be that concern or distinction would start to fade away unless you bring it back, and really emphasize, hey, this was a computer that generated it. If you're just sort of looking at the art in the moment and the art appears to be authentic, I think you will treat it in an authentic way and respond to it as though there was a real person behind it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a very interesting point, because you say in the moment, which I think is interesting, where I think the criticism and debate of art would definitely be kind of colored by the authorial figure. I was about to say author, but again, we're talking about AIs here too, so let's be an author as we know it, and the source if we are using a more neutral term. But yeah, no, thank you so much. This is very interesting stuff.
Thank you, Thomas. And we have 3 more questions. Eamon El Bedoui, do you want me to read out the question that you put in the chat? Sarah writes to me that I should read it out. Eamon asked, how could you conceive the question of limit with the scientific advances to reserve our humanity versus technology and VR? I think that's one of these questions where people are a bit afraid.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, the question is divided into two parts in the chat. So first part is, how could you conceive the question of limit with the scientific advances? And she also writes, to reserve our humanity versus technology and VR. I think the point is like whether we preserve our humanity if we're surrounded with beings that are AI.
Yeah, so, well, I think that's what I tried to get at in the end is what is humanity is also a construct. So we determine ourselves what we think is important. And I think what we see is important is shaped by those around us. And so the extent to which technology assumes characteristics which we find important, we feel threatened, and we either stay in that threatened state or we find some other important way to find meaning. I guess what we're seeing, we've generally seen ourselves as intelligent. As that's become threatened by machines, now we start to see ourselves as emotion is important. And if machines become emotional, maybe there's something else, I don't know, that we can construe ourselves to be. I think, that's a sort of passive view of it, that we are sort of having to react to whatever the technologists do. The more active version would be, should we, as a society, place constraints on what technology could do to try to preserve what we think is important? So should we say, as some have called for, ban the use of machines doing judgments that we think require human intuition? So should we, for example, use technology to determine if a faculty member should get tenure? That's actually considered in certain departments. And it actually is done in certain, I think it's more open to that in technology fields. Some feel that is inappropriate. But oddly interesting, some who are not in power might actually prefer an algorithm to do these things, because they might feel that the people in power are biased in how they make those determinations. And so that, for example, in music, one kind of bias, going back to Thomas's remark, is we often look to that, the humanity of that, but we look at the appearance and the behavior of that person, and who we decide is a good musician is actually shaped a lot by that appearance in a way that has often been viewed as biased. And so many interviews are now done blind to try to avoid that human bias. And so I think, a lot of it comes down to, what do we think is or isn't appropriate for machines to do? But I think that's going to be a changing debate. And often our intuitions don't necessarily match reality. I'm not sure that's a very good answer to your question, but it's a tough question.
Yes, it is. And I just want to add here that my recent publication of research union literature suggested that instead of researchers write grant applications, we should simply, the grant applications should not be assessed by humans, but they should be randomly taken out, 1 out of 10, because the idea was that the bias, you pick the people that you know or the research that you know, because it is impossible to say which research is the best. So I thought that sort of tied in with maybe sometimes the best is to have an AI make a judgment rather than have a human being make a judgment who might be biased. So that's, well, that was a comment. And then there is a question here from Stephen. And Stephen, do you want to talk? I can see that you are allowed to talk.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. And say thanks, Jonathan. Fascinating talk. So many things that I actually want to say at the moment, just even in relation to what you talked about with Thomas, because I'm really fascinated by AlphaGo, the AlphaZero, and I follow it in chess. And the AlphaZero in chess is phenomenal, way better than any of the previous ones. And the previous computers would beat you through brute force. But AlphaZero wins in a way that's beautiful. And so in this question of creating works of art, it plays games that chess grandmasters will say, well, that is just an absolute masterpiece. It doesn't matter that it's an AI. The concepts it came up with are just beautiful to think about. And so that's one thing that's really really impressed me about the developments in AI, is just seeing what that can do. And I was also really fascinated by, in your talk, by the sort of virtual therapist and the interview that you showed with the soldier, and the way that they responded to them. Because if I've come across like human or simulations of emotion, it's in big video games. So LA Noire or Deus Ex both have sort of moments in the game where you're supposed to read a computer character's emotion and guess what they're thinking and respond appropriately to get information out of them. But when that happened, I was trying to guess the algorithm behind it. Like, what is the programmer who programmed this thinking? I'm not responding to them like a human being. And yet the soldier did seem to open up. So I'm just wondering what you've seen in the way that humans respond to these AI. Has it shifted? Has it got more significant? Or is there a difference between how they respond to these AIs than they would to a human being?
Yeah, that's a complex question. And a lot of, so the thing with Ellie, so what we tried to do in that project, I didn't give all the story behind it, but we're trying to find ways to get people to open up. And there's two kinds of processes that tend to lead to people to open up. One is to reduce fear of negative judgment. So people often who have mental illness, disclosing that illness makes them weak. And so they don't want to be negatively evaluated. And so therefore they don't want to talk to a human, because humans by nature negatively evaluative. They do social evaluations. And so that's why often people use computer forms rather than talk to a person. On the other hand, the other way you get people to open up is through rapport. We get you to show those active listening behaviors that convey that you're being listened to. And so what we did in our research is we actually tried to manipulate those two processes separately. And so what seemed to work really well is that we emphasize, hey, this is an AI that you're talking to. And that actually reduced people's socio-evaluative concerns. They didn't feel like they're being judged. And yet in the moment, the character was showing these behaviors that make people get drawn out. So in a sense, we created something that you couldn't do with a human. It's somewhere in the middle. It's leveraging some of the strengths of being a computer, but also leveraging some of the strengths that humans do to draw interactions. And so it's a complex story. And I would guess that if we made that computer even more realistic and showed some of the subtle behaviors that people show when they're, say, negatively evaluating you, then people would start to treat it more human. And actually that would undermine the effectiveness of the approach, because now suddenly it would seem just like they're talking to a person, and they would start to clam up because they would worry the computer is judging them. And so I think you have this kind of whole palette of knobs you can pull to kind of create a whole spectrum of different techniques. And people are really influenced both by the prior beliefs they bring to the situation and what's going on in the moment. And so you need to kind of think about how to manipulate both of those aspects to achieve the particular effect you're trying to achieve. I'm not sure that quite answers the question you're asking,
No,
but definitely,
fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sharon, you are next. And do you want to talk, or should I read out?
No,
can talk.
Yes,
I
please.
had just two comments. You know, during your talk, my brain was storming on all the applications of these things. For instance, the issue of visual recognition in art, which we are working on right now in a digital humanities project I am, or in a cultural heritage application where we are actually trying to understand the viewer's reaction to the artworks and etc. And also I wanted to note, you probably know this note, but Yuval Noah Harari, which is a very futuristic historian, very famous, said that the future of humanity is actually in cyborging between human and machine, in emphasizing emotions. So he expects that this is the future.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk wants us to be cyborgs too, but I don't think he mentions emotion per se. So how does he see emotion play out? Does he see that as something that's the uniquely human contribution to the cyborg relationship, or?
No, actually the cyborgs will emphasize on human emotions, will offer a larger variety of emotion, a more explicit enhancement of emotions. He has a whole theory about it.
Interesting. I'll have to look at that. I would say the state of emotion research or affective computing research right now is actually has a very impoverished view of emotion. So most of the technology, they look at your face and they think they'll take a decontextualized image of your face and say, oh, she's happy, because I see on your picture here, you're smiling, so you must be happy right now. Obviously, human view of emotion is much more subtle and contextual, embedded in what's going on in the situation. And a lot of what I've been trying to do in my research is to get the technologists to take a more rich, nuanced view of what emotion means. So just to say that I don't know that we'll see those cyborgs being better at emotion anytime soon, but that's an interesting proposition. I mean, I think what the computers, are much better potentially at, memorying, at taking a broad perspective of what's going on across time, looking at subtle changes and things. And in some cases, the technology is actually better than people. So there have been studies, for example, that people think that computers can't possibly be good at knowing what I think is funny. My friend is much better at knowing what I think is funny, but actually you can have these computer recommendation systems that are better recommending jokes that you personally would like than your friend would be. So there are things that computers can do better than people, but I'll have to read Harari's stuff. It sounds interesting.
Sharon, thank you. And you could actually put the quote or the reference in the chat, because we are recording this. Then, we can download
with me, but I guess in his book, in his second book about.
Yeah. Yes, and I have a question before we go on to Richard, and that is whether you should stop sharing your screen, Jonathan, because then your face will be big. Yes, and then I will make the speaker view, which means that when you speak, you are big, or I can. I'll find out. Anyway. Richard, you're next.
Oh, okay. Thank you for a very rich talk. Just have a quick anecdote and then a question. The anecdote is I have an acquaintance who's an engineer, and a number of times he's said to me out of the blue that he wants to design an app that would allow you to argue with your GPS. When it tells you make a turn at the corner or make a U-turn, and he gets very annoyed with it, and he wants to be able to win a fight with it. Which reminds me of the original Star Trek, where there's a Harcourt Fenton Mudd builds a robot of his wife so he can win arguments with it. My question is if AI are being trained to predict or help, and I'm putting everything in quotes, normal people have they also been trained to either predict or simulate or in some way help people who would be labeled as mentally ill in some way? And can they do that, and what would the problems and implications of that be?
Yeah. So there's, well, let's go back to anecdotes. That in the dawn of AI, there was the early systems like, I don't know if you're familiar with ELIZA, was a system that was designed to simulate a Socratic therapist. It was a text-based chat, and you would it would ask you questions, and people actually felt like it was a real therapist. And then the follow-on system was, I think it was called Perry, was designed to simulate a schizophrenic patient. And the researcher was very proud of that technology, and thought this captured the essence of schizophrenia. And one prominent critic at the time says, well, I can perfectly capture a catatonic patient, and just by, building a system that returns nothing. So, but just to say that there's been long tradition of trying to create some technology that either simulates mental illness or could act as a scaffold to help illness. So in some of our work, for example, we try to simulate virtual characters that exhibit signs of depression and PTSD that a medical doctor trainee would practice interviewing skills with, to see if they could ask the right questions. That's on the simulation side. On the therapeutic side, there is a lot of actually work on autism, which is often characterized as a disorder in processing emotional information, on building either robots that simulate emotion that a kid could work with, to practice their emotion decoding skills. I even saw there was a proposal to use Google Glass to use automatic facial expression recognition techniques to put in your vision, oh, that person you're talking to is happy or sad or angry, as a proposal for how to help people with autism spectrum disorder engage in better social interaction. Now, in terms of the problematic nature of that, often technologists have a very simplistic view of what emotion is. And so these robots, or that tool I just described, they will do something like, oh, the person is smiling, therefore I'll tell that person they're happy. Where in fact, people smile when they're frustrated, they smile when they're angry, they smile when they're being polite. And so the potential problem with these techniques is that they are training us something, yes, but it's not clear that they're training us something normal or natural. And I think there's a lot more excitement about the technology and less excitement in actually evaluating whether the technology is doing the appropriate or correct thing. And there's a feedback loop where, we are actually shaped by the our perceptions of what it is to be normally human is shaped by the technology itself. So I mentioned briefly a study that, people that watch a lot of TV, they start to think that normal human emotional behavior is the behavior that actors are showing, which is not what normal people do. But then as all of us watch TV now maybe we think that's normal, and we all start acting in that way. Just so throwing too many ideas out there, but just to say that the technology can be used to scaffold and shape and help us overcome certain disorders, disabilities, but it does it in a particular way that may, in fact, change the nature of social interaction in ways that are not necessarily beneficial.
Thanks.
Interesting. Thank you. On my list, Stefan is next, and then I've put myself on the list, and then I have one hand. So Stefan, go ahead and ask.
Right. Thank you for a very interesting talk. First of all, it was amazing. I wonder, and you might have partially answered this question already. I mean, there is the hypothesis of the uncanny valley that the closer you get to a human appearance, the more we sort of feel connected to it up to a point, and then suddenly that sort of goes down drastically. And I wondered if there is something similar to that in the mimicked emotions or expressed emotions, that you could get closer and closer, and at some point it suddenly starts feeling awkward or weird with a machine interface displaying emotions like that. And I wondered also if that's why the examples you showed at least did not express any phatic language. They had sort of feedback in motions, but not in speech, like yeah, that kind of language seemed to be absent, or that might have just been the examples.
Yeah, so there's a, just to address the last point first, there's a technical reason that the characters don't convey stuff through language, which was originally, that was the plan, but they often got it wrong. So someone might say something about their wife leaving them and kind of laugh at themselves, and the character would say, "That's great." And so what we found was we had to tone down a lot of the feedback in order to not create these very jarring misattributions of what was going on. Now, in retrospect, that actually might have been a good thing as well, because I think the more that the character conveys that it's evaluating the content of what you're saying, that might make you think, oh, ooh, maybe I should be more polite. Maybe I should not reveal this information. So the Uncanny Valley is something, it was proposed by Japanese roboticist Mori, that he argued that as things start to look more and more real, we start to get creeped out by them. It hasn't been heavily studied empirically, but the general view of what's going on there is there's a mismatch between visual fidelity and behavioral fidelity. So classic example is the movie Polar Express, where the characters looked quite real, but they didn't quite move in real ways, particularly their eyes seemed dead. And so that argued that that makes it seem like it's unhuman. And kind of the way to think about that is the more real you are, the more degrees of freedom you have to express behavior. And if you're not utilizing that degrees of freedom in the kind of quote unquote correct way, it looks wrong. Something is wrong. And so if you're very stylized, and you see our characters are sort of visually more stylized, you can kind of steer away from that problem. And we actually played a little bit. We actually had a robot, anthropomorphic robot from Ishiguro's lab in Japan, who builds these lifelike characters, that was driven by our therapist and tried to ask questions, and people found that very disturbing and uncanny. I think that there's been some work that suggests that just the fact of a machine, if you really think of this as a machine and the machine is portraying itself as having emotion, some people view that as unnatural or uncanny in of itself. But I think, again, a lot of it is the mismatch between using those things appropriately. So the more you try to, so like emotion has a whole logic to it. And so someone was talking about GPS. So like if a GPS takes you to the wrong way, it might say it's sorry. It doesn't do that now. Be nice if it says it's sorry, but sorry means something. And you often interact with technology that says, oh, I'm sorry you're having trouble right now. And then it hangs up on the phone on you. But for humans, sorry is a communicative device that has a whole script around it that says, okay, I recognize I did something wrong. and I will make a change to do something better in the future. And in fact, then if you have a long enough interaction with that entity, you will see that change. And so I would argue that that much of what we do with these virtual characters when we put emotion in it is we kind of have more like the appearance of emotion. It's like lipstick on a pig, as we say in the South, but it's not actually enacting the full function that emotion serves. And that lack of implementation is conceived as something is off, it's something wrong, it's uncanny. And so I think to the extent that we can make everything work the way it's supposed to work, you could make something quite real and not trigger that weird response. It's when there is this mismatch that triggers something that's off and makes you feel uncomfortable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I put myself on the list, and Stephen is next. Jonathan, I was thinking about this. You said that the AI, if we thought of it too much as a human, then we could get mad and we would withdraw, for example. I think it was in these therapeutic talk.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, is it possible to, and one comment in the chat is, you should consider using non-realistic characters. A dragon will be conveyed as much more reliable. And my question was actually whether if you build an AI character that didn't look like a human being, but for example, like an angel or a dragon or some kind of supernatural being, whether that would create an interaction that was something we thought was a human being like ourselves, but actually something new. You were talking about this middle ground, or that the AI character opens up the possibility for an actually new kind of emotion.
Yeah, interesting. I think about the emotion part, but it's definitely the case. So what things look like set expectations. They create affordances for interaction. How things behave create affordances for interaction. And we really need to, when we're designing systems, we ought to be thinking not too often, I think our field focuses on the real and making it see that human interaction is the gold standard and everything should be driven towards that. And I think that's easy to do because we collect data on people, but it's kind of limiting. And if we think more at the level of affordances, it opens up the opportunity to create new and novel things. And you can see, for example, there was a famous study by Sarah Kiesler at CMU where she took the same dialogue system and it was either talking to appearance was either a dog or a person. And people thought and felt much better about the talking dog, because in some sense dogs don't talk. They have low expectations that dogs would talk, and so they thought the system was very intelligent and very fluid, whereas if it was a person, they had very high expectations of how it should work, and they had much more negative evaluation of the exact same system. And you may have noticed in some of our interactions, we used a foreign accented speech synthesizer. The doctor in one of the scenarios I showed spoke with a Spanish accented speech, and that's because people don't actually, Americans at least, don't have a lot of experience with that accent, and so they don't know how that accent is supposed to work, and so it doesn't violate their expectations when it gets it wrong. So yes, in general, I think you need to think more broadly about what is the effect you want to achieve. And so a dragon, for example, may convey a whole set of expectations. There's a whole backstory or fantasy around that. And in fact, more than just the appearance, it's important to create I think, you have the opportunity to create sort of backstories around these characters that set expectations, and those backstories are quite important. We did, for example, a study in a therapeutic application where we either tried to have the character convey a truthful backstory. It would say things like, okay, I was created here 3 years ago by scientists, it would explain itself in a very computer-like way versus it would tell, some fantasy story about itself, and people were actually more comfortable talking to the sort of fantasy character than something that was described as a computer, because they didn't quite know, how one should interact with a computer. And that backstory can be told up front, but you also can develop that backstory over time as you interact with the character over time, and form a mental model of what they are, what their capabilities, and what they are able to do. So there's a whole number of tricks that one can use to help people intuitively understand what you want them to think about the interaction, and focusing on pure realism is a very limiting way to go, as all storytellers know.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking if I was depressed, maybe I would prefer speaking to something I thought of as God rather than a psychologist, for example. I'm not sure, because God could give me a better answer. And anyway, Stephen is on my list to ask a quick question. So please.
Really enjoying the discussion, everyone. So I just have another, I'll try and keep this a quick question, but I'm just wondering, Jonathan, how working with AI emotions, has that made you reflect on what emotions mean in terms of humans? Because there's a sort of interplay metaphorically between how we talk about the human mind and computers. So we'll often use metaphors now, and say the brain is hardwired or programmed to do things. But then, of course, people who work with AI say, no, we thought this problem would be much easier than it turned out to be, and it made them realize just how complex certain aspects of human thinking actually are. Have you found something like that when you deal with emotion? Has it made you rethink those psychological theories about human emotion?
Yes. So I'm very inspired by the work of Herb Simon. He was one of the founding fathers of cognitive science and artificial intelligence. He wrote this book, The Sciences of the Artificial, and he really kind of laid out the argument for the importance of algorithms in psychological thinking. That, when you create an algorithm, well, on the one hand, you're forced to make the theory concrete. So psychologists, describe a broad theory, but they have these constructs in there that they haven't necessarily completely thought through how to realize. But as a computer scientist, you actually have to build it, and it has to work. And so just the act of building that algorithm often reveals very missing or fuzzy aspects of the theory. But then once you've created that artifact, that becomes an empirical artifact that you can actually now study. So you can run simulations with this model, or in our case, you can attach this model to a character and have people interact with it and see if the social interactions that people have are analogous to what they might have with a real person. And when it falls down, what is missing. And so part of my, I contribute both to computer science and psychology, and some of our work, as we develop these models, it shapes our views on emotion theory. And I don't know if I can quite articulate all the details, but for sure, often in AI, the things that seem the simplest at the surface turn out to be enormously complex. Things that are intuitive and effortless for people require an enormous amount of machinery learning to realize. And so one is you just become more in awe of what humans can actually do. In terms of emotion, how is it transformed? I guess, some of what, I don't know if I can easily convey without a much longer discussion how my thinking of emotion is shaped, but I think over the years, I think I've become much more appreciative of the sort of situatedness and embeddedness of emotion that often we kind of view. So, and this kind of mirrors the transformation of research in AI. So AI, early AI had a very kind of Cartesian God view of reasoning. So the idea was you have a representation, there's the world, and then you construct a representation of the world, and then you can reason about that representation, and then use that to drive action. So there's a very influential book by Lucy Suchman called Plans of Situated Activity that talks about some of these ideas. So her analogy was the difference between the metaphor of a European navigator versus a Trobriand Islander navigator. So the idea, the fiction of how people think from the European perspective is the navigator looks at a map, he constructs a plan, and he executes that plan. Whereas the Trobriand Islander, gets on the ocean and he feels his way through the currents and gets there. So he's reacting moment to moment to the situation. And early models of emotion, our early work on appraisal theory, what I talked about, these top-down models, is very much like that navigator. We construct a plan, we have these goals, we have representations, we manipulate those representations, and we output an emotion. And what I've had much more appreciation now is that emotion is much more situated, reactive, cued to moment changes in the environment, the social actors you're with, and then how do we, represent those or implement those kind of situated activities is still an open challenge in terms of the algorithms.
Stephen, yeah, thank you. And I can see on my computer that it is now time for us to end. And Jonathan, this has been so rich. And I'm glad that we ended with the, what's it called, the bottom down, the bottom up. Because that is like the bottom up is that emotions are really generated via the environment and not via thought, right?
Yes.
And I think that sort of makes it, maybe it's an answer to the comment before, whether the AI will make humans redundant, because then it won't, because we need to be in a world, right, in order to have emotions.
So then the robots will make us redundant. It's not the AI.
So thank you, and thank you to all people for your questions. And we are out of time. Okay, I'm going to stop recording now and say thank you to Jonathan Gratch.